Hey, what's going on? It's Riffee. I'm here to deliver your skeletal system notes. This is going to be part 1A. I'm going to try to divide them into smaller sections. Hopefully that'll alleviate some of the stress of doing the notes at home, and also hopefully it'll allow you more time in your evening to get other things done or be able to spread your work out over more time. So here we go. I found some pretty morbid pictures for you. I do remember when I was in college, one of our professors, as like a project, he actually took a bone model, essentially, an entire full-grown human skeleton model, separated it just like this, but he piled it into one pile, and he had one for every group. And what they essentially did was they tasked all the groups with putting the skeleton back together. It was extremely fun, but extremely taxing and difficult. I'm not going to make you do that, but we're going to have some fun with the skeletal system anyway, so here we go. So we're going to start off with our general things, the skeletal system and its functions. You should always know that any functions that are listed here for any of the organ systems are always going to have some interdependent effects on other organ systems and result in the entire homeostasis of the body. So we'll just kind of get into them in this manner. So the skeletal system as a whole includes bones, cartilage, ligaments, and other connective tissue. The one thing it's not going to include, it's not going to include tendons. Tendons are going to be included in the muscular system, even though tendons embed themselves into bones of the skeletal system. That's where muscles attach and whatnot. But those are actually going to be included in the muscular system. So let's get a quick picture up here. This is going to be the joint of your knee. It's a synovial joint, but so it's composed of your femur, which is going to be your thigh bone, your tibia, and your fibula down here. And if you notice, this picture here kind of encompasses all the main parts. You have bone, you have cartilage, you have ligaments, which ligaments are going to connect bone to bone. Here's a ligament here on the outside, ligament here on the outside, and your ACL and your PCL and your MCL and your LCL. All of these things are very commonly torn by high school athletes, but all of these things connects bone to bone. And the cartilage protects against the ends of bones from friction and whatnot. All of these things are going to be considered part of the actual skeletal system. So now getting into the functions, here we go. So the support and structure or framework for the body allows you to stand upright. This should be fairly obvious. Without your bones, you'd be a giant puddle of flesh and fluid and liquid, such as water and blood. And to be honest with you, it just wouldn't make life very much fun. So thank your skeletal system for a nice framework for which you can stand up. It also stores important minerals such as calcium and phosphorus. You'll come into play with this with like nervous system function, actually muscle system function, but calcium plays a major role in that, and when you tap your reserves in your bone, you can actually continue normal functioning of your nervous and muscular system with the calcium reserves you have there. It's also a storage unit for lipids. Lipids, particularly in the bone, is going to be called yellow marrow, but remember, lipids are adipose tissue or fat. It also does hemopoiesis. This is done solely by the marrow of your bone, particularly red marrow. But your blood cells, this includes white and red blood cells, are primarily produced in the marrow of the sternum, the coxae, which are your hip bones, ribs, vertebrae, clavicle, which is your collarbone, and cranial bones of your skull. You also have the long bones of your body, such as the femur, the tibia, fibula, humerus, ulna, and radius. The one most obvious thing that a lot of people come up with besides support and framework of the body is that it protects tissue and organs. Just solely think of your rib cage. Your rib cage surrounds some of the most important organs, your heart and your lungs and your liver. Well, the surrounding of there is there for protection of those internal organs. The other most important thing you think of is your skull. Your skull protects your brain. Your skull is very dense, it's very hard, but it's actually not very thick. One of the big things that actually gives it a whole lot of framework for support and protection is actually the fact that the joints of your skull bones do not move. We'll get into that later, but let's continue on. The other thing it does is it provides leverage for locomotion. Your muscles attached to your bones. Locomotion is just a fancy word for movement of the entire body, but without your muscles being attached to your bones work against your muscles, but your muscles end up being stronger to resist that movement, and that actually causes the pulling of your muscles on your bone actually causes your bones to move, which moves the skeleton as a whole. What's amazing to think about is how much coordinated effort this takes between your nervous system, your brain, your muscles, and your skeleton, all of those things. Just imagine a baby learning to walk. It's crazy how much it actually takes to master that skill. And then I want you to imagine losing that ability due to some kind of injury and have to relearn it. Really would be something else. Something you also need to know is that the your skeletal system plays a major role in depending upon the muscle system. Your bones will not grow without the constant stimulus or stress that is put on them by the muscles pulling on them. The more stress or stimulation you give to your bones by moving your muscles, your bones actually can become denser, thicker, and stronger. So it's kind of a side function that you kind of get there. Some random stuff that you not need to know, but I thought would be really cool is that adults human have about 206 bones. That's the most accurate average number, but it can be upwards of 216. There are these things called sesamoid bones that actually can form throughout your body, but it's not as common, so they don't actually count those as bones. And then at birth, you average about 300 bones, but a lot of those that they're going to consider bones have a large percentage of cartilage in them. And as a baby rapidly grows, you'll notice that those will fuse. Your skull has 22 to 29 bones protecting your brain, eyes, ears. Your spinal column has 26 bones protecting your spinal cord itself. The rib cage, 25, which includes 24 ribs and a breastbone. And you know that your breastbone or your sternum can actually be divided into 3 parts. The manubrium, the body, and the xiphoid process. They're there to protect your heart and lungs. You have your shoulders, arms, hands for movement, grasping. 64 bones in your shoulders and arms. The pelvis, legs, and feet, you'll notice is 62. So just between the legs and arms and hands and feet, almost half of the bones in your entire body are just located in those appendages right there. So I thought that'd be some interesting information. Other things you don't necessarily need to know, but I thought would be cool. The thigh bone, your femur, is actually stronger than a steel bar, and that largely comes down to how the tissue and cellular arrangement inside those bones are. So it's actually stronger than a steel bar, the same size and shape. Your bones can withstand up to 24,000 pounds per square inch of pressure placed upon them. That's tremendous. I think I actually have a YouTube video that shows a femur bone being put into a clamp and then squeezed down until it snaps in half. A person walking can exert 12,000 pounds per square inch on the thigh bone, and then I want you to imagine all of this, compare that to the amount of pressure when women wear high heels, how much pressure is put on just the end of that heel. It's crazy. The longest bone in your body is your femur. It's a quarter of your entire height, and the shortest or smallest bones are going to be your auditory ossicles of your inner ear. They are unbelievably strong and delicate. So let's get into bone structure. So you can take any bones of the body and kind of classify them into 4 groups. If you consult some other resources, they're going to have 4, possibly 5 groups. But if you'll notice, these 4 are going to be the most common groups with them. Then they're going to have sesamoid bones and some other ones that you're not going to need to know. But long bones, they are longer than they are wide. Hence why they're called long bones. And they typically will have an expanded proximal and distal ends called the epiphysis. These are things like your humerus of your arm, your radius and ulnar of your forearm. You have your femur, which is your thigh, and your tibia and your fibula will make up your lower leg. And then you have the phalanges of the hands and feet. You have short bones. They're going to be cube, square-like. Some cube and square-like meaning is a relative term. It's not going to be a perfect cube or anything like that. But the height and width of the bone is nearly equal. You're mostly going to find these in the carpals of the wrists and the tarsals of your ankle. Then you have flat bones. The thing about flat bones is a lot of people will confuse flat bones sometimes with the regular bones, but you have to think, is it more irregular or is it more of a flat bone? They are thin, relatively broad, plate-like. Imagine putting your food on them and eating out of them. These are things like your scapula, which is your shoulder blade. Your ribs, even though they are long, they are relatively flat, so they're actually going to fall into that flat bone category. And then a lot of your cranial bones of your skull, particularly things like the frontal bone, the parietal bone, the occipital bone, all those that you're going to consider of the upper part of the skull, those are going to be a lot of your flat bones. Then you have your irregular bones. These things have a very complex shape to them, which means they also fit a very complex function, but they don't fit into the other categories. They're not flat, they're not short, they're not long, they're just weird looking. So usually they are connected to several other bones. So one of the big things is all of your facial bones, all those crazy ones I'm making you memorize for the skull in terms of your face, they have no regular shape. They're flat, but they are crazy shaped flat bones. So those are going to be your regular bones. Then you also have your vertebral bones or your vertebrae. Those bones, even crazier shape. So if you look at this diagram here, you'll notice flat bones, long bones, excuse me, short bones, and then you have your irregular shaped bones. Okay. So, if I threw a little quick practice quiz up there, no, this is not an entrance card. Could you identify the bones simply based on their appearance and fitting into those 4 categories? So, what you have here, think to yourself, is it longer than it is wide? Nope. Is it short and cube-like? Nope. Is it extremely flat? Nope, that only leaves one category of irregularly shaped bones. These are the bones of your vertebrae. This is the one closest to your skull, which provides for rotational movement. We'll get into that at another time. So if you look at this one, this would be your scapula. This is an extremely flat plate-like bone, meaning it is, you guessed it, flat bone. Then you have these. These are going to be the bones of the wrist, the carpals of the wrist, or, you know, to be honest with you, I don't know if they're the tarsals either, but these are, see how they're more cube-like? I prefer to not use the term cube-like as much as they look like rocks that you would find in a creek. These are going to be your short bones. And then the most obvious one and easiest one to identify are going to be your long bones. Notice how it has a very widened proximal and distal end to them, or the epiphysis, and it has an extremely long, what is called the diaphysis, or a long axis or shaft of the bone. Alright, so now we're on to entrance card question number 1. So we've kind of gone over all those entry things that you would need to know about bones and kind of how they're classified into the 4 shapes, and then how also, you know the functions of bone and how it will pertain to the body and maintaining homeostasis. So we're going to do something new here. So what I want you to actually do is, on an index card, I want you to actually record the question on one side, and then you're going to put your answer on the other. That way you have some kind of study resource. But question number 1 is going to be, all the functions of the skeletal system contribute to homeostasis in some way. Which functions of the skeletal system do long bones, example your femur, which I did put a picture of it right down here, perform and maintain homeostasis for the entire body? So what I'm asking you is, if you took just the femur itself, just this bone right here, and it's a long bone, of those functions, I believe there were 5 that I listed there, of the skeletal system, which of them apply directly to a long bone such as the femur? Make sure you kind of explain your answer. Alright, so now let's go through typical bone parts, and what we're actually going to refer to here are long bones more than anything, so we're going to get into this. The epiphysis, on the ends of long bones, they're in large rounded ends. And they're largely made from what is called spongy bone, and we'll get that into a second, and they contain red marrow. Remember a few minutes ago where I mentioned red marrow is the type of marrow that actually produces blood cells, red or white blood cells. There's 2 types of marrow, red and yellow. We'll talk about those in a little bit more. But you also have what's called articulated cartilage. Where 2 bones meet, it's actually called an articulation, which in the terms that you would have known prior to this class, that would be called a joint. But basically, articular cartilage covers the epiphysis of long bones in order to prevent bones from bone-on-bone contact, which results in a lot of high amount of friction, and if you know, friction produces heat, heat damages tissue, so articular cartilage produces a barrier to damage in joints. Then you have what's called the epiphyseal plate. Now we're still talking about the expanded ends of the bones and the epiphysis. So articular cartilage is going to be around the epiphysis of long bones, and then also within there you're going to have what's called the epiphyseal plate. What this is it's a section of cartilage that is found between the epiphysis and diaphysis of a long bone. It has a lot of cartilage and chondrocytes there. What those cartilage and chondrocytes do is they constantly turn that cartilage into bone. And it expands and expands and expands. This is what actually causes you to grow as a human being. So when you hit puberty and early adolescence, you will actually find that these cells in this cartilage conversion into bone is actually very, very, very active and causes it to happen, and you grow in great amounts at this particular time. Now, once you reach full height, that epiphyseal plate no longer is cartilage. It actually turns into a fine line. It's actually an identifying characteristic in determining age when a skeleton is found randomly out in the wild. And if you have a long bone, you can actually determine the relative age of the human being when they died based on the presence or absence of epiphyseal cartilage or the presence of an epiphyseal line. The diaphysis is going to be the long central shaft that's located between the 2 epiphyses of the bones, the proximal and distal. Remember, proximal is closer to the torso of the body, and distal is away. Again, the outer portion of the diaphysis and actually the outer portion of the epiphysis is covered in dense, compact bone. And it actually has, in the diaphysis, it has a hollow inner cavity. This is called either the marrow cavity or it's called the medullary cavity. Either way, what's contained in there is going to be spongy bone and bone marrow. The bone marrow fills the spaces within the spongy bone. Inside that marrow cavity of the diaphysis, like I just said, you will notice that you will have yellow marrow and red marrow. Excuse me. Other things you're going to have there is the endosteum. Inside that marrow cavity, there's a lining where that spongy bone is, and it makes kind of like a contact between the spongy bone and the marrow. That is going to be called the endosteum. And the periosteum, remember, if you remember your prefix peri means around, the periosteum is a tough outer covering that surrounds the diaphysis and the epiphysis of the bones. It's actually where blood vessels enter the bone tissue, and it's actually where tendons, ligaments, and things like that actually form their attachment points. So looking at this diagram here real quick, which is pretty fantastic, you'll notice all the different parts that we were talking about. So you have the expanded regions called the epiphysis. You notice how they are wider than they are the diaphysis here. You have a proximal, which means closer to the attach point, and you have the distal, which means away. And then you will know that this particular bone here, which I believe is the humerus, this part inserts into the shoulder, so this is where it articulates or come in contact with other bones, forming a joint. That's why you will have articular cartilage there. Down here at the bottom, this is where it forms a joint with the elbow and the ulna and the radius. Therefore, you have articular cartilage there, also reducing it. You have blood vessels that enter the bone itself, keeping in mind that, yes, if you break a bone, bone does bleed, but those blood vessels enter in the periosteum, which is that outer lining that covers the outside of the diaphysis and the epiphysis all the way around, but then it kind of discontinues once the articular cartilage comes into play. And you'll notice that compact bone surrounds the outer edge of the medullary cavity, otherwise known as the marrow cavity, right here and right here. And it also extends up into the epiphysis and surrounds that epiphysis all in this area also, all the way down. We'll get into the function of that later. Just inside that compact bone layer right in here, you'll notice the bone tissue develops a different looking structure to it, and also up in here in the epiphysis. Remember, if we rewind back a little bit, you will notice that I said the epiphysis is largely composed of what is called spongy bone. It has the same types of cells as compact bone, which lines the outer portion of the bone, but instead of forming a very dense, compact nature, it actually forms open spaces. And this open space here is where all the marrow, red and yellow, fills and provides its function right there. And that's why it's also called the marrow cavity, is because spongy bone fills inside there, and then you also have marrow that fills within that. You will notice that you have blood vessels traveling throughout that, but then they also embed themselves into the actual trabeculae, which is of the spongy bone. And this is just going in a little bit more detail. Something you don't need to know is you don't have to know about these perforating fibers, but what they essentially do is they attach the periosteum to the compact bone tissue and nutrient arteries and veins, otherwise known as blood vessels. Here's an actual cross-section diagram of the head of the humerus, so this is going to be the proximal epiphysis. You'll notice that surrounding this particular area here, the articular cartilage has been removed, but you'll notice that there is compact bone tissue all around here. You will notice there's spongy bone in here, and this will extend down into the medullary cavity. And this fine-looking line that runs across here is actually the epiphyseal line. You'll notice that there is really no cartilage forming here, meaning that if we did an x-ray of this particular humerus wanting to determine age, we would know that this person has reached full growth, and we can have an age determination based on that. So now let's get into microscopic analysis. When you look at bone tissue itself, which you have based on Unit 2, since bone tissue is one of the types of supporting connective tissue, you saw the arrangement of bone tissue, but we're actually going to go in a little bit more detail now. So bone tissue can actually be divided into two types. You have compact bone, and its name is exactly as clever as it sounds. It's very dense, packed tightly together bone that forms the outer edges of the diaphysis and underneath the periosteum and at that outer edges of the epiphysis, and it forms a very solid, rigid structure. Then you also have spongy bone. Spongy bone, another name is called cancellous bone, but there forms a network of what are called rods and struts, but really and truly their real name is called trabeculae. And they have spaces between that trabeculae that's normally filled with marrow, either red or yellow. Remember, red marrow, typically found in the skull, breastbone, vertebrae, hips, end of long bones. What their job is to do is it actually produces red blood cells. And yes, you can actually donate marrow. And there is a marrow bank just like there is a blood bank. Yellow marrow is simply a lipid reserve that is used for energy, whether by the bones or throughout the entire body. If you did a cross section here, you could also see that this is actually the femur. So if you cut it completely in half, you'll notice that the periosteum folds back. You have blood vessels that embed themselves in through the periosteum and into the bone tissue. You have compact bone tissue on the edge, followed by spongy bone tissue on the inside, followed by marrow that fills that, and then actually these are going to be your blood vessels and actually can be nerves too. One of the big things I need you to understand, it's actually a very common misconception that bone is like this rock tissue. It's actually not. It is living tissue that, in fact, if it breaks, it bleeds because there's blood vessels that are within it, and if it ruptures, it can bleed. Bones can become infected. Bone tissue can actually die just like anything else. Bones are roughly 30% living tissue, 45% mineral deposits, and almost all of that mineral deposit is going to be calcium phosphate mineral deposits and 25% water. If you take that calcium phosphate mineral, it's also combined to form the matrix of bone, which combines with collagen fibers. Collagen is actually a flexible but not elastic fiber. This is what allows bones a little bit of bend but not break. So they are tough, and bone and the collagen fibers contribute to the ability of bone to bend a little bit, so that it actually doesn't break instantly when extreme force is applied to it. So entrance card question number 2, here we go. Again, remember, right, the question on one side and the answer on the other. Crohn's disease is a chronic inflammatory condition of the gastrointestinal tract. It's called your GI tract or your intestinal lining. That results in, I should actually say, abnormal homeostasis in the digestive system. So basically it causes the digestive system to deter from homeostasis. How might Crohn's system disease, which affects the digestive system, actually affect homeostasis of the skeletal system? Alright, so let's talk about compact bone tissue. I am so sorry this is running long. I was not expecting this to happen, but here we go. Compact bone tissue is bone tissue that is arranged in systems called osteons. And these osteons, another name for them is going to be Haversian canal, but they're these big circle tree trunk looking things that if you cut a tree in half and looked at the rings, that's kind of what it looks like. But they are a repeating system of osteons, and each osteon itself, each one individual tree trunk tree trunk itself that's been cut, can be broken down into separate individual parts. So if we look at this right here, what you will notice is this entire large circle guy right here, and this entire large circle thing right here, these individual large circles are osteons. So in this picture here we have 2 osteons. And you'll notice that I already have labeled some very, very important parts of the osteon, but we're going to get more into those here in just a second. One of the first parts is going to be called the Haversian or central canal. I want you to use the term central canal, but you have to give credit where credit was due, and so I'm assuming that the gentleman that discovered them, his name was Haversian, so being the conceited scientist he was, he named him after himself. But anyways, inside each osteon, there's a very, very central darkened circle, and that's essentially where vessels that run into the bone tissue run vertical or parallel with the diaphysis. What this does is it allows veins, arteries, nerves, and lymphatic vessels to reach the entire length of the bone, so it travels up and down the length of the long bone. These Haversian canals are essentially the central point of nutrients and waste dispersal. So if you look at it here, you'll notice this has a huge Haversian canal or central canal right here, and inside of here, if we had the ability to, you would see anything from veins, arteries, lymphatic vessels, etc. Here's also another Haversian canal, not as dark and not as circles because this osteon isn't as big. Lamellae. Lamellae are essentially rings. If you looked at a dartboard and you know it has rings as you go away from the bullseye in the middle, each of those rings that is largely composed of that calcium phosphate material or the calcified bone matrix, each one of those rings is called a lamellae. They're cylindrical in shape, very dense, and they encircle the Haversian canals. If you look here, if I were to draw, again, I'm not very good at this whole drawing thing, but here we go. Here's one lamellae that encircles it. You'll notice that here's another one. And you'll notice that it just keeps forming rings. Yeah, I'm not doing a very good job of drawing this. But it keeps forming rings. I think this one's probably a little bit better. You'll see the border of a ring right here. Oh, I did a much better job with that one. Here, you'll see a border of the ring right here. Oh my gosh, this one's way better. And you'll see the border of a ring right here. Oh my god, look at that. It continues over here. But each one of these rings, that is actually called the lamellae itself. Lacunae. Everybody say lacunae. Lacunae are the small spaces that exist between lamellae. They're those small, darkened, oval-looking circles. And what they do is they contain a little bit of fluid, but inside of that fluid, those are where the mature bone cells, otherwise known as osteocytes, are trapped, and that's where they exist. So if you look in between each of the rings of the lamellae, you will notice that in that little area here, these little darkened circles here, and here that are trapped in between the rings, those are lacunae, and inside of those lacunae are mature bone cells that actually their main job is calcium recycling and maintaining the bone stability, I guess you could say. But each of these things are lacunae with the osteocytes in them. What I also want you to pay attention to is the fact that you have all these really tiny radiating lines that are coming from each of the lacunae. They're going to play an important role here in just a second. Those tiny radiating lines, so those are actually called canaliculi. What they are is they're actually parts of the osteocytes that are trapped within the lacunae, but they look like very, very small canals, and they radiate out from lacunae, and they actually attach from one lacuna to another, and each of those lacunae eventually reach the Haversian canal. If you remember correctly, inside the Haversian or central canal is where the blood vessels are located. Blood vessels carry nutrients, and they also get rid of waste from cells and tissue. So what happens is, by being able to attach themselves to each other and then to the central canal, it allows for nutrient exchange between the blood vessels without the blood vessels having to be attached to each individual lacunae themselves. So keeping in mind all these little tiny radiating lines that kind of go everywhere, if you want, I can do some of my fantastic drawings. Each one of these tiny little radiating lines here, that if you'll notice they connect between all the different lacunae, and all of them end up in one specific spot, which is the central canal. Then you have what are called perforating or Volkmann's canals. Don't use the term Volkmann's, again, named after somebody, but perforating canals, their main thing that they do is they actually connect Haversian canals. So Haversian or central canals run up and down in the tissue, and perforating canals run perpendicular. Perforating canals actually also extend out into the actual periosteum, the cells for blood vessels to insert themselves into the bone. You cannot see those in this diagram because this is a superior view looking at a cross-section of the bone, so you would actually be looking in the exact same direction as a perforating canal, so we're not going to be looking at those in that particular picture. Interest card number 3. Answer the question below. Question on one side, answer on the other. Why do you suppose compact bone, which is that dense outer portion, has the repetitious osteons throughout, and that arrangement of the osteons is somewhat random? Why do you suppose compact bone has repeated osteons that are random in location throughout compact bone? What would be the function or the purpose of that? And looks like I gave you kind of the answer here. But compact bone tissue is made to bend a little, but not really a lot at all. What it is if you have a long bone, you will notice that in a long bone, let's say this square is the long bone, compact bone runs around the entire outside of that long bone. What that also means is that the compact bone is situated in the same direction as the long bone or the long axis of the bone. What that means is forces can be applied in this direction and in this direction, and because of the way the osteons in the compact bone are structured, those forces can be absorbed, and that shock or stimulus can be absorbed very, very easily. The bad thing is, though, when a force comes in from the side onto compact bone, the structure of the osteons and the way it runs is not meant to withstand that, and it actually bends to the point of breaking, and that's how you end up breaking bones. Alright, spongy bone. After we talk about this, I promise we'll stop. So, spongy bone. It has a completely different lamellar arrangement. Remember the rings of the trees on compact bone? Instead of having that, you would consider spongy bone to be like branches. They still have osteocytes within them, but instead there are no osteons because it's not compact bone. Instead of forming rings, they form what are called rods or plates called trabeculae. The trabeculae branch in various different directions, and it gives spongy bone a very open network looking like a sponge. Huh? Clever name. And what that happens is it allows marrow to fill those empty spaces. Spongy bone tissue is usually found where bones are not stressed very much or where a stress can occur in multiple directions. Remember, compact bone is made to withstand stresses in only really one direction, up or down in long bones, or towards the ends of the long bones, whereas spongy bone can actually withstand stresses from multiple directions. And what that is the network of trabeculae actually helps promote the protection of red marrow in the locations in the epiphysis of each of the long bones. If you look at this, this is a wedge of bone that has been taken out. If you'll notice this area out here, this is actually the compact bone right here. And then all of this area here is the spongy bone. Notice how it forms rods and struts that have empty spaces within them that allows it to fill with red marrow. That's why it's called spongy bone. Entrance card question number 4. A large percentage of the bones in the human skeleton are composed of both compact bone and spongy bone tissue. What do you suppose would occur if the entire human skeleton were solely composed of spongy bone rather than being composed of both compact and spongy bone? Good luck with that question. And that's where I'm going to stop.